second group of insects that can affect young plants are cutworms. And what is a cutworm? It's a little complicated, but all the insects we call cutworms are a kind of caterpillar that are all in one moth family, Noctuidae, sometimes known as the cutworm armyworm family. This is a big family, and only some of those are the kinds of cutworms that we are going to be talking about at this point. All of these caterpillars have adult stage moths that are pretty similar. They're brown or gray, maybe have a little bit maroon, maybe have some mottling. Typical wingspan might be about 2 inches, a little less. Moderate sized moths. Not a huge moth, but a pretty big moth. They fly at night, though. All of them fly at night, so you're rarely going to be seeing them unless you're out at night or you're looking at lights. The larvae of cutworms, similarly, are not particularly distinctive. Lots of different kinds of cutworms. You probably have 4 or 5 different species wherever you live, and that'll be different across the country. But they tend to be gray or maybe a brown, or might have a little bit of some metallic sheen to them, or greasy appearance, but nothing very distinctive on most of them. And typically they'll curl when disturbed, which is a habit other caterpillars do as well, but it's quite consistent with the insects we call cutworms. Now they hide during the day, so you're not going to see them. So they're going to be usually hiding around the base of the plant. So if you dig around, you might be able to find them. So there's a cut bean plant, and you dig around somewhere around there is usually where you're going to find it during the daytime. So there's a little cutworm caterpillar there, fairly good sized cutworm. Now, when I say it's a little complicated in terms of what is a cutworm, a way that they are sometimes subdivided. We use the term cutworm for caterpillars that might have slightly different habits. So we subdivide them and call some the climbing cutworms, and these would be ones that might be up high on the plant or in a flower or something. Then there are some that never get above the ground. They're feeding below ground. Those are subterranean cutworms. But most of the ones that cause damage early in the season are active right around the soil line, maybe a little above, maybe a little below, but right around the soil line. And might be out on the soil at night. They're surface feeders and cut plants. So again, different kinds. Climbing cutworms we're going to talk about in some other contexts. These are ones that might be up in a plant and might damage fruit or some above ground part of the plant. And then subterranean cutworms, we'll just probably touch on this a little bit in turf grass, but they are usually pale. They're not exposed to sun, so they don't have the pigmentation that you'd have with ones that expose themselves to light. The surface feeder cutter types are, again, kind of gray or brown, and there's different ones where you live. So granulate cutworm would be a species pretty common in the southeastern part of the United States. Black cutworm, common one in the Midwest. Army cutworm, common one out where I live in the Rocky Mountain region. And then there's one that's new and throughout much of North America. It's called the winter cutworm, a little bit bigger than some of the others, and it's active in winter. Sometimes people are seeing these out and around in November, maybe a warm day in January, in fairly advanced stages, and they turn into a moth that is different from what I've been telling you. They are a gray or brown moth, but they have really striking underwings, as you can see in that picture in the lower right, orange or yellow underwings that are quite distinctive. You wouldn't see that with these other kind of cutworms. And this is newest one because it's a non-native that's become recently established in North America over the past couple of decades. Now, general habits of the ones that are attacking young plants are that they're going to be laying eggs in areas of dense vegetation, and they'll often be doing this in fall, but not always. So weedy areas, you had a weedy garden, or low spots, might have some different kind of rank vegetation. These are areas where you tend to have egg laying concentrated, and many of the cutworms that we're talking about here survive winter as larvae, a small larvae that feeds when it's got enough warmth, and then matures sometime in the spring and does most feeding in the spring. So the damage they do is largely associated with young plants in the spring, and the kind of stand loss they're going to produce is plants disappear. It's not the plants come up, and then they get chewed on, and maybe they get chewed on and cut and taken away and consumed. But unlike a root maggot, where the plant may not even emerge, or you get some sort of distortion because of the underground feeding, a very different kind of effect on the plant with a cutworm. Again, different kinds of cutworms occur in different areas. The one that's known as the black cutworm is actually one that has quite a wide distribution worldwide and is highly migratory, a little bit different from what I've mentioned before. This is one that is more subtropical species, and it will winter in extreme southern United States along the Gulf of Mexico. But many of the ones that we find throughout the eastern half of North America in the summertime originated from as far away as Central America. So quite a strong flyer and a very aggressive species in terms of causing plant damage. The insect is particularly well studied here on corn, which is what this slide is taken from Iowa State, because corn, of course, is such a big crop in the Midwest where this insect is so important. And what I'm using this slide, though, here to show you is it shows different stages of this caterpillar. You know, they grow, they molt, they get bigger, they molt, they get bigger. And this is an insect that isn't big enough to start cutting plants until it's in the fourth instar or larger. So people track this. They scout for it. They can predict when the eggs are being laid by when the moths fly into an area. And then using temperature records, they can estimate when you're going to have these fourth instar larvae. Now, the other thing I've got in this picture is it shows the different larvae and gives estimates of how big they are based on their head capsule. So this is maybe a little arcane, but the head capsule of a caterpillar is a structure that you can use to tell how old the caterpillar is. It is the only hard part of their body. The rest of their body isn't heavily sclerotized, so it can get considerably large during the process of being an instar between one molt and the rest. But the head capsule is always the same until it molts, and then it gets bigger. And it molts in a predictable way. It's actually called Dyer's Law in entomology, a pretty obscure concept, but the basic idea that was discovered by Dyer was that there is a predictable geometric progression in the size of a head capsule of a developing larval insect. And if you work it out, you can figure out how old and what stage a caterpillar is based on its head capsule size. And typically, the head capsule increases about 1.5 times with each molt. But it varies a little bit with species. So, again, the head capsule is constant. If you see a caterpillar, I'm not sure if this does it really well, but the one on the top is a caterpillar that is just about ready to molt. And when you see a caterpillar that's got a tiny little head capsule compared to its body, that's one that's just about to molt. And then it molts, and then it's got a fairly big head capsule relative to its body, and the body will get bigger because it's, again, not sclerotized and hardened. But until it molts again, the head capsule will be the same. Anyway, a little side note there. The cutworm that we have in this area, and this is the army cutworm, and this is a common cutworm pretty much in the western half of the United States. You can get it all the way to California, but it's particularly abundant and particularly damaging in the mountain time zone states, the Rocky Mountain, High Plains area. And it's a very interesting one. I'm going to get into it a little more than maybe some of you care if you don't live in this part of the country, but it's got an interesting habit of migration that I think is worthy of you knowing about. So it's a typical caterpillar. It's our common cutworm around here, and it develops in the spring. It develops throughout the winter, but finishes developing in the spring, and it feeds on young plants in spring. It's feeding mostly on broadleaf plants, so it's feeding in alfalfa and it's feeding in some of the garden plants. You find it in lawns, you find it in winter wheat. Usually it's taking out, though, the broadleaf weeds before it goes into grasses, but it will feed on grasses as well. So in this case, they've cleaned out the broadleaf weeds. And then when it's done, maybe early May, maybe even April, it's done. The caterpillar might wander, find a little soft soil, tunnel in and make a little burrow and pupate in there. And there we see a cutworm pupa, pretty typical. Most cutworm pupa look something like that, um, maybe about an inch long or so, brown. And then out of that comes the adult. And the adult form is a cutworm, typical cutworm moth. And around here we call it a miller moth. And this is the miller moth of the Rocky Mountain region. Now, this term miller moth, let me just say, is not a scientific term. It's a term that people give to a moth that is locally abundant. And why do they call a moth that's locally abundant a miller moth? It's because moths have scales on their wings, and those come off. They're kind of like dust or flour. And someone who mills grain is a miller. And if you mill grain, you get flour on your clothing. So these are miller moths. They produce little, in this case, scales on their wings. Anyway, different moths are called miller moth depending on where you live. My brother in San Francisco, totally different kind of moth is called the miller moth there. You live in Georgia, you might have a totally different moth that you call the miller moth. But in the High Plains, Rocky Mountain region, army cutworm is the miller moth, and it's an interesting one. It has variable wing patterning, but they're all cutworm kind of range of colors and patterns, and they have a habit of migrating after they become an adult. All the other cutworms in North America, when they become an adult, will then mate and lay eggs. But this one becomes an adult and delays laying eggs until autumn. And in the interim, it follows flowers as nectar sources and tries to stay cool. So it follows the flowers and stay cool. And this has the effect of causing a very interesting migration. This is the most significant moth migration occurs in North America. And these moths are all heading for high country. Where I live, and just at the base of the mountains in eastern Colorado, all of the moths that are coming out of fields from eastern plains of Colorado and western Nebraska and western Kansas, all of them head for the Rocky Mountains. If you live up further north or further south, there's different higher elevation areas where they will go to. But it's a migration. So they come through in May and early June, going up to the mountains, and they may have a return migration in the fall, and only in autumn do they lay eggs. And they're going to lay their eggs out in various fields, and the caterpillars will become a young cutworm caterpillar in autumn. I know they're here because whenever we start seeing these swallows start dive bombing the intersections, miller moths are in town. This is because these moths get into automobiles when hiding during the day, and when people stop at a stoplight, they open the window to shoo them out, or they come out of the undercarriage. The swallows figure this out to the day that these things come through, and just wait for cars to deliver them, and then they feed on them. It's a great food source for birds around here. It also can become a huge flight in some years. So look at this. So this is Tyler's house in Walsenburg, May 2020. Had a big flight during this year. So those are all the ones that are outdoors in his house. Now he lives fairly close to the mountains, so all these moths are ones that have traveled across southeastern Colorado. Some of them came from Kansas probably. They're all going to pass through his property and end up in the high elevations during the summer. During the day they hide. They get in cracks, crevices. Sometimes that causes them to be able to go through a little crack and end up in a house. And then if they're in the house, drives people nuts. They're not doing anything in terms of hurting anything. They're not feeding on anything. They're not laying eggs. They're not clothes moths. But for some people, having moths in the house pushes their button. Now, the reason that some properties tend to have more in their houses, I think is interesting, and may hope it be interesting to you as a Hort student, is landscaping. Some people say, I've got tons of them in my house, but my neighbor never seems to have all that many. And it's probably because you have planted in your yard some very desirable looking plants, but also happen to be desired by night flying moths, like anything, any prunus, my euonymus, the burning bush, the tree lilacs, not the common lilac, Russian olive. Oh gosh, they love Russian olive. Anyway, you have a lot of these plants around your house. They're going to be feeding on them at night, and they're going to be hiding nearby, and they may get into the house incidental to that. They also like to hide in sheltered areas like dense evergreens or deciduous shrubs that are dense. And again, you could create a landscape where you'd have lots of Miller moss, or a more deserty one that you didn't have many at all hanging out in your yard. And if you're interested in this, I do have a little question and answer sheet that try to answer all the questions people have on this, and I'll provide it for you as an FYI, but it's not going to be on the test. Again, many of you don't live in an area where this occurs, but this is a unique insect event, this migration of the army cutworm, that I wasn't even aware of until I'd moved out to this part of the country. It's not mentioned outside the mountain time zone states. So anyway, getting back to management of cutworms as a problem in a crop, uh, usually problems are going to be associated with sites that were weedy, had dense growth when they're laying eggs, and the key pests are laying eggs in late summer, early autumn. So if you had cleanly cultivated field at that time, then they'll lay few eggs there, so you have less likely chance of problems the following season. Um, Tillage, this is one kind of insect where tillage can work because this is not a mobile insect between seasons. It's a little caterpillar. The eggs were laid, the caterpillar hatches, and if you had some sort of destructive tillage through the winter, this is one kind of insect that you would kill. Um, and Carefully check plants. These are unpredictable. Uh, you could have big problem one year and nothing the next, and vice versa. So regular checking of plants is important, and you're checking for plants that show a little bit of chewing, or a plant that fell over because it got chewed on at the base, or disappeared. And then look around and see if that's the issue. And then there are steps you can take. You could protect seedlings with a protective collar. Um, Protective collar. This is an old cutworm control. Just some kind of physical barrier around it. I just cut a discarded coffee cup to make this one here for my pepper plant. Or you can use insecticides. There's some baits, formulations, and some sprays that work pretty well. The products here are mentioned that work pretty well on these kind of caterpillars. One thing that doesn't work very well is BT. The common BT for caterpillars is a strain that is weak on cutworm family caterpillars. Works great on a cabbage worm, works great on a hornworm, doesn't work well on cutworms. So we have to change the strain if we're going to use BT, but generally you use something else. Anyway, that's it for cutworms, and I think